For what purpose does the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 53, I call up the bill S5 and ask for its immediate consideration in the House.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Senate 5, an act to require the Secretary of Homeland Security to take into custody aliens who have been charged in the United States with theft and for other purposes.
The House is not in order. Members, please take your conversations outside of the floor. Pursuant to House Resolution 53, the bill is considered read. The bill shall be debatable for 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary or their respective designees. The gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, and the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to insert extraneous material on S5.
Without objection.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, S5 bears the name of Laken Riley, murdered by one of the 8 million illegal aliens that Joe Biden and his Democratic supporters deliberately allowed into our country over these last 4 years. In Laken's case, the murderer was paroled into this country through a shocking abuse of that power. He was repeatedly arrested for theft and other crimes in sanctuary jurisdictions, and each time released back onto our streets. Just months before he murdered Laken, he was arrested for theft. But ICE couldn't take him into custody because of the Biden-Harris administration's policies that shielded such monsters from arrest and deportation. This measure, first introduced by Representative Mike Collins, would require ICE detention for illegal aliens who were charged with, arrested for, or convicted of any burglary, theft, larceny, or shoplifting offense. Now, the Democrats have argued that, while mere accusation of committing a crime should not be grounds for detention, and besides, shoplifting's no big deal. Well, they ignore the fact that every illegal alien is currently required to be detained by current law throughout the pendency of their asylum claims. The Democrats have thumbed their noses at this law for the past 4 years. Their excuse is that they are prioritizing detaining more dangerous offenders. Well, this bill does exactly that, yet they still oppose it. During his first term, President Trump proved that the president, on his own authority, can secure our borders. President Biden proved that a president who's determined to make a mockery of our immigration laws can willfully open our borders to the most violent criminals, terrorists, gangs, and cartels on this planet, and then use the Democrat sanctuary laws to protect them. This national nightmare ended at noon on Monday. But what of future presidents? This bill assures that what happened to Laken Riley cannot happen again should another Joe Biden disgrace the presidency. Now, our Senate colleagues have added to the Laken Riley Act parts of Sarah's Law, introduced by Representative Randy Feenstra and Senator Joni Ernst, to mandate detention for illegal aliens who commit any offense that involves death or serious bodily injury. Sarah's Law was named after Sarah Root. On January 31st, 2016, as Sarah drove home after celebrating her college graduation, an illegal alien who was street racing while drunk slammed into her SUV, snapping Sarah's spine and fracturing her skull. Sarah died 4 days later on February 4th. Within hours of her death, a judge set the illegal alien's bond at $50,000 because no detainer was filed, despite a desperate request by local police to do so. The administration defended this dereliction of duty because, quote, the illegal alien had not been convicted of a criminal charge and therefore was not an enforcement priority. S5 closes this loophole by requiring detention for illegal aliens, like Sarah Root's killer, excuse me, who are arrested for, charged with, admit to, or are convicted of any crime that resulted in someone's death or serious bodily injury. In addition, this bill includes elements of Representative Jeff Van Drew's Detain and Deport Illegal Aliens Who Assault Cops Act, which passed the House last year and applies the same mandate for those who assault law enforcement officials. Now, this bill would also allow states to bring a civil action against derelict federal officers who refuse to enforce immigration law. This was first introduced by Representatives Dan Bishop and Chip Roy in the Sue for Immigration Enforcement Act. That bill also passed the House twice as part of the Laken Riley Act. That bill was also killed by Senate Democrats last year. Well, whether it's sober reflection or perhaps the sobering results of the November election, a handful of Democrats in both the House and the Senate have now come over to support this law, and we welcome them. We wish them well in convincing the majority of their party that they need to change course, if not for the good of our country, then at least for the good of themselves. We'll take their support any way we can get it. I have every confidence that President Trump will end this scourge upon our nation during the next 4 years. This law, and the others that will follow it, will assure that no future president will be able to unleash upon our country what Joe Biden and his Democratic supporters did. I urge my colleagues to support it, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I rise in opposition to S5. All these fine speeches, all these fancy parties with billionaires and congressmen in tuxedos, all these executive orders for big oil and the tech broligarchs, all these complete and unconditional pardons for Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, and violent extremists who chanted, "Hang Mike Pence," and smashed, swarmed, and wounded our police officers in this building with steel poles, baseball bats, American flags, Confederate battle flags, and bear mace. All this sound and fury on day one and week one, but nothing to bring down grocery prices, nothing to bring down the cost of rent as they promised, nothing to improve our healthcare system or build on our success in the last Congress in reducing prescription drug prices, nothing to get health insurance coverage for millions of people who don't have it, nothing to bring down the cost of housing or build new housing, nothing to combat the nightmare of climate change other than the full-scale retreat of withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord, nothing to address the real problems faced by the American people. So today they want to change the subject from the indelible and shocking public safety disaster of the president releasing hundreds of convicted felons, specifically violent cop-beating felons caught on tape in the act, whom he had incited on January 6, 2021, back into the population with no plan for protecting the American people or the public safety. So what do they want to talk about today in their wisdom? Public safety and immigration. Well, great, let's do it. This bill does nothing to address the major problems we face in the immigration system or to secure the American border. Nor does it do anything to address the major problems we face in public safety, such as the central and overriding problem of out-of-control gun violence, which takes tens of thousands of American citizens' lives every year and is the leading cause of death among American citizen children up to the age of 18. Now, Mr. Speaker, it may surprise a lot of Americans, but we actually know how to solve these problems, how to make substantial progress on both immigration and public safety. The roadblock is that the majority completely lacks the political will to do it. Why? Well, the Republicans are divided between two extreme positions. The big business tech oligarchs who bankroll their party, who love cheap foreign labor under the current regime, and the inflamed nativist mega element who want to shut down all immigration, including legal immigration, and believe in right-wing conspiracy theories like the racist Great Replacement theory. Look, Congress could pass bipartisan, comprehensive immigration reform this week. Senate Republicans and Democrats reached a powerful and painstaking compromise with President Biden last year to fortify our border with more border agents and more enforcement, more detection technology, more asylum judges, and more funding. But President Trump told House Republicans to tank this popular bipartisan agreement, to sink it. He didn't want a bipartisan border solution to improve things in the real world. He wanted a permanent border crisis to run against on TV. Not doing anything means that Trump doesn't offend his big business supporters who want cheap foreign labor under the current regime, but it allows him to pander indefinitely to his mega base with nativist rhetoric and tiny little messaging bills that move a few words around but don't fundamentally change anything. We should add to the tough border measures already negotiated last Congress a meaningful pathway to citizenship proposed for Dreamers, TPS holders, and other law-abiding, productive immigrants. If we move from demagoguery to deliberation, we can flesh this out and we can make immigration work for America, a nation built on immigrants. We have huge job shortages in agriculture, in manufacturing, in retail, in seafood, in nursing and hospitals, and many other areas. We should not be plunging America into chaos to deport millions of people when we already need millions of new people to work here. If the GOP plan of deporting 12 million people were really to happen, it would plunge us into another Trump economic crisis like the last one under COVID-19, but maybe even cause a depression this time. The vast majority of Americans know what common sense dictates. We must make it a lot harder for people to get into our country illegally, but we must make it a lot easier for people to get into our country lawfully. Today, only 2% of people seeking admission lawfully are admitted, and Donald Trump and his first administration crippled legal immigration into the country. He banned many legal immigrants unable to prove that they have high incomes. He banned immigrants from 13 specific countries. He banned most visa applicants and most skilled temporary workers, deeming them an economic threat. We must reform our system consistent with our values as a nation. Similarly, when it comes to public safety, we could arrive at a common sense, bipartisan agenda right now to make our communities a lot safer if we were serious about it. Let's take the central problem of gun violence, for example, which now takes more than 48,000 American lives a year and is the leading cause of death for children and young people in America up to the age of 18. Gun violence costs America an astonishing $557 billion a year, Mr. Speaker, more than $500 billion a year because of gun violence. Mass shootings with an AR-15 or other assault weapons have become a terrifying feature of gun violence in America, although they account for just over 1% of the tens of thousands of lives we lose generally to gun violence, where old-fashioned handgun homicides and suicides and accidents continue to cause the vast majority of death. Here are some policies that the vast majority of Americans support that we could pass this week if they would allow us to do it, Mr. Speaker. Congress could close the loopholes in the Brady legislation, like the internet loophole and the private gun show loophole. We could pass universal violent criminal background checks on all gun purchases, something supported by upwards of 90% of the American people. Vast majorities of people of both political parties, independents, conservatives, liberals, gun owners, non-gun owners, almost everybody supports it. We could pass a military-style assault weapons ban, which more than 60% of Americans support. We could crack down on the proliferating danger of ghost guns, and we could expand red flag laws nationwide. Alas, our colleagues refuse to do any of it because their well-advertised compassion for the American victims of violent crimes committed by undocumented aliens, which they base their entire argument on and which we all share, apparently does not extend to the far larger class of American victims of violent gun crimes committed by other American citizens, even though we have not just 48,000 Americans killed every year, but 115,000 American citizens wounded and maimed trying to survive this gun violence debacle handed to us by the NRA and their followers in Congress. They argue that the Second Amendment prevents all these common sense gun safety measures, even though the Supreme Court has repeatedly upheld them, including an assault weapon ban, criminal background checks on gun buyers, and so on. When a white supremacist gunman bearing an AR-15 assassinates dozens of American citizens' school children in Connecticut or Florida, dozens of citizen and non-citizen Walmart shoppers in El Paso, Texas, or supermarket shoppers in Buffalo, or worshipers at the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, or worshipers at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, our colleagues extend only thoughts and prayers. They say nothing can be done, alas. There's just evil in the world, and the Second Amendment keeps them from acting. We just have to accept this as the inescapable human price and sacrifice paid for the Second Amendment, even though that's not what the Supreme Court says. Well, at least today shows they think something can be done to stop violent crime in America. Will they take their newfound sense of moral outrage and compassion and apply it not just in one case, but to the tens of thousands of victims of gun violence in America? America is waiting for an answer. What is the majority proposing today? Well, S5 is a bill to subject to mandatory detention not just undocumented people who've been convicted of theft, shoplifting, and other criminal offenses, which has been the law supported unanimously by both parties since 1996, but people who've been simply charged with such offenses or arrested for such offenses, even if the charges are dropped or even if they're never filed in the first place. It's an odd way to fix the border because it has nothing to do with the border, and it's an extremely attenuated and constitutionally dubious way to promote public safety. The vast majority of serious crimes committed in America are committed by American citizens, not aliens, and the vast majority of aliens don't commit crimes at all. But this bill doesn't even focus on the culpable class of undocumented immigrants who commit crimes. That the law already does. It focuses on those who are arrested, even if they're never charged, or those who are charged with crimes, even if they're never convicted, or even if the charges are dropped. A young person in Dhaka who's with a group of friends, when one of them is arrested for shoplifting and then all the kids get charged, will be subject to mandatory detention and deportation, even if the child was not shoplifting and the charges are dropped. The bill is likely to pass, no doubt, because of the profound sympathy we all share for the parents and family of Laken Riley, who have suffered an unthinkable, totally shocking, and profoundly unnecessary trauma. This should not be a partisan issue, and it should not be demagogued for partisan purposes. But when we get serious about comprehensive threats to public safety in our immigration system, we will have to address the mass crises staring us in the face, like the gun violence epidemic, which takes the lives of tens of thousands of American citizens every year at the hands overwhelmingly of U.S. citizen gunmen. We reserve, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the so-called bipartisan legislation that the gentleman refers to would have made it impossible for President Trump to have taken the actions he has just taken to secure our border until illegal immigration exceeded 4,000 entries a day. That's why it collapsed in the Senate and it was ultimately disavowed by its own author. The gentleman is correct to lament the terrible violence in our nation, especially in our dangerous democratic cities. So here's a modest proposal. Take the criminals off the streets, like Laken Riley's killer, which is exactly what this bill does. I'm now pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Yakum.
Thank you, Mr.
Gentleman's
Speaker.
recognized.
I rise today in strong support of the Laken Riley Act. The Biden-Harris administration was marked by failure and corruption. But the failure that sits head and shoulders above all others was their open border policy. Almost immediately after President Biden was sworn in, America was overrun by a massive, unprecedented surge in illegal immigrants. The chart next to me shows just how dramatically President Biden failed compared to his predecessors. Over double the southern border crossings of any president since 2001. This border chaos was ignored for all 4 years of the Biden and Harris administration. It was downplayed as seasonal or written off as mere ebbs and flows. Find me somewhere on this chart where the surge was only seasonal. Show me where it ebbed or flowed. Illegal immigrants continue streaming across President Biden's open border in droves because they knew they'd face no consequences from an administration that was more focused on inventing new rhetorical flourishes to paper over this very real crisis. More content to wish it away rather than actually do something about it. President Biden's failure at the border had impacts across America. Every town was a border town. Once sleepy places were suddenly forced to contend with sex trafficking, drug trafficking, child labor, infectious diseases, petty theft, and yes, even rape and murder. Cartels got rich, and small towns in my district were left scrambling for money and resources. This chaos was a choice made every single day of Joe Biden's presidency. No more. Monday marked a new era. President Trump has already taken more decisive action in 48 hours than President Biden took in 4 years. Let's send this bill to President Trump's desk. I urge my colleagues to vote for sanity and common sense. I urge them to vote yes. I yield back.
Reserve.
Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman Maryland is recognized.
I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from New York, Representative Espaillat.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to S5. I rise in opposition to S5 because the bill is redundant. In fact, the provisions of this bill to penalize those that have committed violent crimes are already included in a penal code. So this legislation is redundant. What it does do, in fact, is it would force ICE to treat minor offenses as violent ones. That includes, of course, a child caught stealing a candy bar from Walmart, someone who jumps the turnstile in a New York City subway, or takes a box of cornflakes because they otherwise have no way to make ends meet. But it also sends a chilling effect out there amongst law-abiding families and workers who are too frightened to show up to their shifts at farms, hospitals, businesses, and schools across the country. Mr. Speaker, this bill is redundant. And frankly, the Laken Riley family should not be subject to the political theater that's about to happen here today. In fact, we should be looking at this issue to fix the problems of both the border, but also to regularize dreamers, farm workers, and keep families whole. At the end of the day, dreamers are productive. They contribute to our society. Farmers need their workers, and we need their workers. And families need to stay together because families that are divided are weak families, and that makes up a weak nation. So this is a redundant bill. While they are targeting the immigrant communities for stealing a candy bar, the folks from January 6th, get this, were released. They were released and sent out to our communities, felons. Today, I think of Officer Daniel Hodge, whose gas mask was ripped off his face as he was punched in the face and was stuck in between two doors. America saw the film. America saw the video of him crying for help.
Gentleman's time has expired.
We will continue to fight for sanity and against any political theater that happens here on our floor. Thank you. I yield back.
We reserve.
Gentleman reserved. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Feenstra, the author of Sarah's Law that is incorporated into this bill.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of the Laken Riley Act, which includes my bill, Sarah's Law, as an amendment. In the early morning hours of January 31st, 2016, Michelle and Scott Root received the call that every parent never wants to hear. Their daughter, Sarah, had been killed in a car accident. What's worse is that Sarah was murdered by an illegal immigrant who was driving while drunk, 3 times over the legal limit. However, instead of answering for his crimes, the illegal immigrant posted bail, was released and fled our country, never to be seen from again. This egregious loophole in the federal law must be closed. Victims like Sarah Root can receive, and criminals can do the hard time they deserve. That's why, alongside Senator Joni Ernst, I introduced Sarah's Law to ensure that any illegal immigrant who injures or kills an American citizen is swiftly detained and punished for the fullest extent of the law. As a father of 4, I can't fathom the pain the Root family feels to this day. It's truly heartbreaking. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation to deliver justice for Sarah and her family. I look forward to President Trump signing this bill into law so that illegal immigrants who break our laws are held accountable for their crimes. This must be done. Thank you, and I yield back.
Reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Florida, Representative Frost.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I oppose this bill for many reasons, but I really want to get to the heart of the problem for me. On day 1, President Trump started his project to deport thousands of our neighbors, even legal immigrants, asylum seekers, and people who were born here in the United States. The Laken Riley Act is another piece of that tragic project. Laken Riley's death is a tragedy. She should be alive today. And I'm glad that that killer is facing accountability, as should anyone who harms an innocent person. But we got to be really clear about the bill in front of us. This bill does not make our communities safer. It gives this extreme president the authority to do something that actually most Americans don't agree with. Changing our laws so that way any immigrant is detained if they are accused, not convicted, accused of a crime undermines due process. This bill requires the government to detain people who pose no risk to our communities. It's a shameful bill that will result in the violent detention of innocent people and children. Many are going to regret enabling Trump's brutal agenda, and the question is when? When abusive boyfriends trap women in violent relationships by threatening to falsely accuse them of a crime, will you think back to this day? When ICE raids a kid's classroom or goes into the Sunday school service to lock up some classmates, will you feel shame then? When there are no more resources because we've been prioritizing looking at promising young DACA students and rounding them up for no reason, will you regret voting for this bill then? Our country has failed to ensure that every American has the resources they need to live a good life. And it's because of the greedy, richest 1%, corporations and spineless politicians that you don't have health care, that you need multiple jobs, that your check isn't big enough for those bills, and that you can't afford to rent and buy, but it's not the fault.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I grant the gentleman an additional 1 minute.
It's not the fault of our fellow Americans who might be undocumented. The solution here is not violence. On its face, this is an evil bill meant to empower a violent man who is not interested in solving the problems of working people, but interested in power. And it seems that any bill that gives him power, he and his party will ruthlessly pursue. but not me. I urge a no on this bill and yield back.
We reserve.
Maryland. Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities towards the president. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd remind the gentleman that current law already requires every illegal immigrant to be detained. That law is simply not being enforced. This bill says if that illegal alien, who's supposed to be in custody anyway, is arrested for other crimes, they really have to be taken off the streets. If this bill had been law, Laken Riley would be alive today. I'm now pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Van Drew.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. You know, before I started, and again, these are not prepared notes, but I wanted to address a few of the things that the ranking member, Congressman Raskin, mentioned. And it seems to me that from what I hear on the other side is everything but really dealing with and focusing on what this bill says and what it does. He wanted to talk about inflation, which, by the way, was created on that other side, food prices and energy and utility, all of it. Want to talk about all that. Want to talk about gun violence. I'm willing to debate gun violence for hours and discuss the issue, but definitely, even on that issue, doesn't want to speak about the liberal policies that exist in so many urban areas where we let out violent criminals over and over and over again and change very often felonies to misdemeanors. You want to know about gun violence? That's what gun violence does. That's what gun violence is created by, so much that is happening there. Their answer would be to put more gun laws in place that inflict more regulation upon honest, good gun owners that don't ever do anything to anybody. It would be to impinge on Second Amendment rights. But I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about this act because I know we are on the right side of this. Laken Riley was killed while going for a jog. That's the issue. An innocent woman who never did anything to anybody harmful in her life, that wanted to be a nurse, that wanted to help other people, that couldn't even get the last damn telephone call from her mother, was murdered. And then I hear from the ranking member, well, the vast majority of illegals don't commit crimes. My God, I hope not, because we've got close to 10 million of them, as best we can tell, but there are hundreds that were on the terror watch list, thousands that have committed crimes and where the problems really do exist, and that's unacceptable. This administration has had recklessly abused the mass parole policies. It's flooded our nation with illegal immigrants. It never should have happened, and it impinges and hurts the security of the American people. We are here to represent the American people. And you know, across the country, we heard about the woman that was set afire in New York City. And what was the first thing that the city of New York, with its liberal policies, did? They refused to honor ICE's detainer request for the man responsible for setting another human being on fire. Our immigration laws have to be upheld. Failure to do so is why Laken Riley is not alive today. It's why Washington State Trooper Christopher Gadd's family will never see him. His children and his wife will never know him anymore. He's gone. It's why when Laken Riley struggled for almost a half hour, when she was beaten, when she was disfigured, when her head and skull was crushed, that we can't bring her back. We can't bring her life back. I don't want to hear about all this other political stuff. I don't think the American people do. They want an answer. And I'm pleased to see the Senate adopted.
Gentleman's time has
I
expired.
yield another 30 seconds to the gentleman.
Adopted the amendment that we wanted, which was to put in there the legislation that we had to detain and deport illegal aliens who assault cops. They've broken the law once. And now we were saying, my God, if you do it again, no, you are going to be detained, and you are going to be deported. And I'll tell you, a lot of Democrats are going to vote for it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields.
Reserve.
Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
I thank the ranking member. Mr. Speaker, I want the American people to know, with eyes wide open, what is inside this bill. Because we stand here just 2 days after President Trump gave unconditional pardons to violent criminals who attacked our nation's capital on January 6th. And these are the people who want you to believe, who want us to believe that they're trying to, quote unquote, keep criminals off the streets. When they are opening the floodgates. I want the American people to know what is in this bill. Because in the guise and in the wake of tragedy, we are seeing a fundamental erosion of our civil rights. In this bill, if a person is so much as accused of a crime, if someone wants to point a finger and accuse someone of shoplifting, they will be rounded up and put into a private detention camp and sent out for deportation without a day in court, without a moment to assert their right and without a moment to assert the privilege of innocent until proven guilty. Without being found guilty of a crime, they will be rounded up. That is what is inside this bill, a fundamental suspension of a core American value. And that is why I rise to oppose it. If you're a dreamer, all someone has to do is point a finger and you will be rounded up. And we have seen moments like these happen before. In the Patriot Act, in the wake of the travesty of 9/11, a fundamental suspension of American civil liberties. That is what we are seeing here today. Mr. Speaker, you may wonder why so many of our friends across the aisle who care so deeply about the rule of law happen to be so desperate to pass this bill, after they are unleashing people who attacked police officers here on this Capitol into roaming our streets publicly. Now they want to get a gun. Suddenly, these folks care about public safety? I don't think so. Look no further than the price tag of this bill, $83 billion. They know that it can't be paid for. They know that the capacity is not there. And you know what will be there? Private prison companies are going to get flooded with money, who give this money, no doubt. I want folks at home to look. Look at what members of Congress are invested in private prison companies who receive this kind of money, and look at the votes on this bill. It is atrocious that people are lining their pockets with private prison profits in the name of a horrific tragedy and the victim of a crime. It is shameful. It is absolutely shameful. And Mr. Speaker, I'll conclude with this. In a few months, there are members of Congress who voted for this bill who are going to pretend they didn't know about all the bad things that are going to happen because of it. So when a private prison camp opens in your town, when a dreamer...
Time has expired.
I yield the gentlelady an additional 30 seconds.
So when a private prison camp opens in your town and they say, we didn't know this was going to happen, know that they did, and they voted for it. When a dreamer is disappeared from your classroom, when the President of the United States destroys what is left of the Constitution as he's announced in this attack on birthright citizenship, they will all say, we didn't know this was coming. And I want the American people to know that they did. This vote represents it. And with that, I yield back. Thank you very much.
And the lady yields.
We reserve.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from California recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes. Gentlelady from Georgia is green.
Thank you. Illegal aliens that have invaded our country and those breaking our laws, killing our citizens, women and children, and causing complete havoc across our great land. I support the Laken Riley Act, and I support the Laken Riley Act because Laken Riley should be alive today. And she would be alive today if it hadn't been for the Democrats and the Biden administration that ripped our border open and allowed this illegal alien monster to come into our country. And then in the state of New York, when this monster was arrested for committing crimes, the Democrat state of New York let him go. And that's how he came down to Georgia and murdered our Laken Riley. This is a bill that cannot get passed enough, and I'm so thankful that the American people overwhelmingly voted for Donald Trump so that we can sign this bill into law, and it can't happen fast enough. Thank God. But listening to my colleagues, the Democrats on the other side of the aisle, complain and whine and defend illegal aliens that break the law the minute they cross our border is pathetic. The American people are so sick and tired of it. They cannot believe what our country has gone through. And it is last policies. You talk about purpose. A young who should be living her American dream. She had the right to do it. Come across our border illegally are not Americans, and they do not have rights here. And that is exactly why anytime they break a law, anytime they cross into our country, they should be rounded up and shipped out as fast as possible. And if we need to build more prisons, then we'll do it. Because the American people will support it. Thank you, Chair. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields.
Reserve.
Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from Illinois, Representative Ramirez.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Thank you, Congressman. Oh. Mr. Speaker, it's hard to keep myself composed when I hear people and their hypocrisies that actually generate profits for them talk the way they do, and then also use God somehow in their speech. Look, let me say this. We cannot realize justice by engaging in grave injustice. We cannot achieve safety by putting millions in harm's way. Honor ideals that we talk so much about in this place by undermining civil rights. Preemptively jailing people is not accountability. It's inhumanity. Mandatory, indefinite detention based on accusations, folks, accusations, not charges, not convictions, accusations. That's a tool of dictators, not democracies. So let me be clear. Laken Riley's death is a tragedy. And we have work to do to protect women and make our communities safer. We should be bringing bills like Break the Cycle Violence Act to the floor, perhaps have a discharge petition and do it right now. But let's remember, undocumented immigrants, they didn't make college unaffordable. They didn't destroy our environment. They didn't deny insurance claims, or they didn't raise our rents. Scapegoating immigrants just deflects the accountability from the corporations and from the billionaires, bosses profiting from everyday American hardships. That is what this is all about. Ending due process so that they can profit. I encourage my colleagues to vote no, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Under.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of Senate 5, the Laken Riley Act. But first, I'd like to point out that my Democrat colleagues are all exercised about the pardons of Donald Trump, of January 6 protesters, but they said not a word when President Biden commuted the sentences of 37 cold-blooded murderers on death row in our federal prisons. This bill is the Senate amended version of Representative Collins' bill that passed this chamber earlier this month. It is named after Laken Riley, the 22-year-old Georgia nursing student who was brutally murdered by a criminal illegal alien. Another casualty of the Biden-Harris Democrat open borders policies. This bill adds burglary, theft, larceny to a list of crimes for which it would be mandatory that illegal alien criminals be deported. The Senate also added a very important provision that adds assault of a law enforcement officer or causing bodily injury to another person to this act. The Laken Riley Act, when signed by President Trump, will begin the long and hard work of protecting Americans from the more than 10 million illegal aliens that were enabled by Biden's open border policies. On January 7th, I was very encouraged to see 48 of our Democrat colleagues in this chamber vote for the common sense protections that Americans support in the Laken Riley Act. Yesterday, 12 Senate Democrats joined all the Republicans in supporting this common sense measure. Look, deporting criminal illegal aliens should not be a partisan bill. I hope our Democrat colleagues will side with us on this issue to protect Americans and put Americans first. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields.
Reserve.
Gentleman from California reserve. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm yielding 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib.
Thank you so much. It is so shameful that the first bill of the new Congress will put a target on the back of millions of our neighbors that work so hard, that build up our communities. It is also going to increase militarization of our neighborhoods. As somebody that grew up in Southwest Detroit, where you'll find 20 different ethnicities, people from all over the world, came together, and you should see how beautifully diverse it is, but how they built up communities and neighborhoods. They're an integral part of our neighborhood. And one of the things that I have been seeing over and over again on social media already, Mr. Chair, is literally militarization of Border Patrol, officials everywhere, just people scared and petrified because that's what's exactly happening, because this promotes racial profiling. The bill blatantly violates due process. I mean, these are literally being allegations and charges, not actual convictions. Y'all act like if somebody's undocumented, they can't be deported. They can. As a former immigration attorney, I know that for a fact. You're making this up so you can literally allow people to be profiled and discriminated against. Blame them for the cost of eggs? Is that what we're doing here? We're blaming them because you guys can't get corporate greed on a side that is a disease that is killing our economy? People can't afford housing? You think it's because of our immigrant neighbors? No. If you cared truly about fixing our immigration system, you'd go fix it so that U.S. citizens married to undocumented spouses can actually adjust their status, where we have mixed statuses because for 30 years we've ignored and vilified immigrants. Enough is enough. It will separate families. It would lead again to continued discrimination. It's shameful that my colleagues are giving in to racist fear-mongering at the first opportunity to pass legislation to scapegoat our immigrant neighbors and fuel hate in our communities. I know what's going to happen. It won't just be undocumented. It'll be people like my mother who will get stopped and profiled. She have to carry her U.S. passport around? Are we asking people allowed to have documentation? That's what you want to turn our neighborhoods into, is militarization?
I yield the gentlelady an additional 30 seconds.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I just ask all of you to truly understand what this will do to our communities. I urge our colleagues to please vote no on this divisive bill. And it's so important to understand what you're going to turn our communities and our neighborhoods into. We can't allow that to continue to happen. With that, I yield.
Members are reminded to address their remarks to the chair. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized. Gentleman from California is recognized. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins. He is the author of the Laken Riley Act in the House, representing her hometown and her grieving family. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank the gentleman for yielding, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to take a minute to talk a little bit about the journey of this bill. When this tragedy happened, and we took a look at what could be done to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And I talked with the family and asked them if we could put Laken Riley's name on it. And their response was, Congressman, if there is anything that Congress can do to make sure that this doesn't happen to another family, then please put her name on it and get this thing passed. That we did. 37 Democrats with all Republicans in the House passed that bill in the 118th Congress. Sent it over to the Senate, and where so many of the other good bills went, it fell into the black hole of the Senate, never to be seen again. Had another discussion with the family later and told them where the bill was sitting and what was going on. And I told them I could never let it go. I just couldn't let this go. Because Laken fought with every ounce in her body to stay alive that day. And I vowed I would fight with every ounce I had to make sure that we protected families across this country. And that we did. I want to thank the family for allowing us to do that. Mr. Speaker, I also want to thank my colleagues for sticking in here and voting with us. Not just the Republicans, but the Democrats. People on the other side of the aisle. Not just in the House, but it went through the Senate. And we had Senate Democrats that went with this bill as well. This is a good bill. It's a common sense law enforcement bill. Simply states, minor level crime now, local law enforcement can contact ICE to get these people detained, processed, and deported. These people, these criminals that come across that inflict violence on American families, they just get more and more emboldened.
Expired. To the gentleman. Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. They just get more and more emboldened. And they create larger and more heinous crimes. And that's exactly what happened here in the Laken Riley murder. Mr. Speaker, I encourage all my colleagues, let's get this passed today. Let's get this done. I'll leave you with one other thought, too. I've always heard a saying, there's nothing with any meaningful legislation that happens in this town up here until the American people demand it. And by God, they're demanding that this get passed and we get these criminals out of our country. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from California is recognized. Reserve. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
We have no further speakers, Mr. Speaker. So we'll reserve.
The gentleman reserves. Gentleman from California is
Mr. Speaker, I'm
recognized.
pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Lamalfa.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you to my good colleague from California as well for leading this charge and being that strong voice. So we seem to have a common California problem anyway on a lot of issues. And reminding people that California is a sanctuary state and some of the first sanctuary cities emanated from California, leading to this problem. And by doing so, Governor Gavin Newsom and the rest of the state is actually defying federal law on enforcing borders and turning over criminal illegal aliens when they capture them and detain them. Lives are being lost because of that. So let me go back in time a little bit so they're not forgotten. Jamil Shah II. Jamil Shah II, at the time a 17-year-old high school student and a promising athlete, shot and killed on March of 2008 near his home in Los Angeles. His assailant, an undocumented immigrant or illegal alien, whatever you want to call it, he was a member of the 18th Street Gang, been released from jail just the day before, prior to this shooting. Later on, he was finally convicted in 2012 and sentenced to death, then commuted by Gavin Newsom. Shah's death led to increasing scrutiny of these policies and hopefully results here today. Let me remind you of Kate Steinle. That one gripped the nation as well. Killed on a pier in San Francisco when an illegal immigrant who shouldn't have been there got a hold of a gun and discharged it and caught poor Kate Steinle. This man was finally acquitted of murder and manslaughter and only put away on possession, fell in possession of a firearm. So this became a focal point in discussions of sanctuary cities as well. We have this opportunity here to not have this happen again and again because we know well, unfortunately, the story of Laken Riley, as that's more fresh in our minds. But we can't go back and forget about people like Jamil Shah, whose father I've met, who was grieving at the time and is still grieving now, Kate Steinle, and so many other names that we're not naming here yet today. We need to do better. Support this legislation. I yield to my colleague. Thank you.
Gentleman from California is recognized. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
We're prepared to close, Mr. Speaker.
I'm ready to close as well, so I yield to the gentleman.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Can you tell us how much time we have?
Gentleman has 6 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sorry that Representative Collins has left. I was just presented with a tweet that he sent out about the New Jersey-born Episcopalian Bishop Marianne Budd, who performed a service as part of the inaugural ceremonies and Apparently, he was not pleased with what she had to say, and he wrote, "The person giving this sermon should be added to the deportation list." And I would have asked him whether he was serious about that. Of course, the Episcopalian bishop is a U.S. citizen, but of course, that's very much in the spirit of the times. Reminds me of the period of the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798, when there was an effort to use the Alien and Sedition Acts, which have been invoked recently by the new president, in order to persecute the political opponents of the administration, as well as to chase down and kick out of the country all of the dangerous French immigrants who were spreading revolutionary propaganda in the country. And a friend of Jefferson's wrote to him, John Taylor, to say how exhausted he was by all of the political fighting and the demonizing of immigrants and the attempt to shut the borders down and to attack political opponents as enemies of the state and so on. And Jefferson wrote him this beautiful letter back. You should check it out online if you can. It's a letter to John Taylor. And in it, he counseled patience. He said, "A little patience, and the reign of witches shall pass over, their spells dissolve, and the people, recovering their true sight, recover the true principles of their government." In the meantime, he said, we're suffering all of the horrors and indignities of the hysteria. But he said, if the game runs against us at home sometimes, as inevitably it will, then, he said, we must have patience, because this is a game where principles are at stake. Our colleagues have spoken up for nothing other than due process. The idea that the bipartisan compromise that has been cemented in law since 1996 should stand, saying that we want the immediate detention and deportation of undocumented people who actually commit crimes. And in an effort to drive a wedge in this body, they now say they want to move from people who've been convicted of crimes, which obviously accords completely with common sense, to people who've just been accused or charged with crimes, even if the charges are dropped, even for offenses as small as shoplifting. In any event, we don't claim somehow that one side or the other is morally righteous and the other is morally wrong. We're trying to have a public policy debate. And the role of public emotion in public policy debates, Mr. Speaker, is an interesting thing. Some people think it's enough to show up and say there's been a terrible event, there's been a sickening murder or rape, therefore you must pass our bill, without even reading the bill, without even looking to see what's in the bill. Does it make sense as a matter of public policy? If that were the standard they actually believed in, they would be voting for all of the gun safety legislation they've been rejecting, because every time there's a massacre, whether it's in Connecticut or Florida or Texas or Illinois or any of our communities, we come in and we say, we want what the American people want in public opinion polls, a universal violent criminal background check. We want a ban on military-style assault weapons. There's no reason 18-year-olds should be bearing AR-15s and showing up in classrooms and churches and synagogues with weapons of mass destruction. If it were enough just to appeal to emotion, they would be voting with us. But no, they say, well, that conflicts with their public policy understanding. Well, at the very least, you think they would have the burden of telling us what they do support. But we never hear anything. You don't hear a peep out of them about gun violence, because the Second Amendment, as they misinterpret it, is sacrosanct, as well as their NRA support and contributions. That's what they bow down to, is the National Rifle Association when it comes to this policy debate, because they won't advance anything that conflicts with the NRA, even if the Supreme Court says it's perfectly fine. We had a ban on assault weapons for a decade. It was perfectly constitutional. We have the Brady Act. We have a violent criminal background check. But even though expanding it to make it universal would save hundreds or thousands of lives, American citizen lives, every year, they won't touch it. So don't invoke emotion selectively and say everybody's got to go along with what you're saying without even analyzing the policy implications and the constitutional implications if you're not willing to put anything on the table to reduce the sickening death toll for gun violence in America. There's nothing in the world that approaches what we've got here. It's 25 times higher than the EU countries, dozens of times higher than Japan, Canada, UK, you name it. And yet they pretend as if there's no problem. And yet they seize on an opportunistic bill like this to try to drive a wedge within our Congress and within our people. I hope they do better when we get to the second week of this new administration than freeing violent criminal felons who stormed this Capitol and attacked our police officers, and then bringing forward a bill like this to try to cover up for their complicity with violence against our constitutional order. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from California is recognized. You have 7 minutes and 15 seconds. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, in response to my friend, I'd say after the last 4 years in which the Democrats brought the full force of the government to intimidate social platforms, to shut down dissenting opinions, and stifle public debate, I'd be a little more careful about invoking the Alien Sedition Acts. The gentleman offers us gun control as an antidote. We offer criminal control. Get the criminals off the streets, which is exactly what this bill does. And I'm sure that he must be very upset that Mr. Biden pardoned his son for gun crimes. Mr. Speaker, to my Democratic colleagues who've joined Republicans to pass this bill into law, I thank you for standing up to the woke left of your party. That's a hard thing to do, especially when it exposes you to their insults and epithets and threats of political retribution. To the others, I ask how many more laws with names attached to them do we need to pass before you take this crisis seriously? How many American citizens must die at the hands of illegal aliens before we all agree that these tragedies are fully preventable? Must the name of my child or your child be the one attached to an HR number or an S number before Democrats can vote yes on these common sense bills? The fine point of the matter comes down to this. If this bill had been law, Jocelyn Nungari, Sarah Root, Rachel Moran, Laken Riley, and many, many more such victims would be alive today because their killers would have been taken into custody. And under President Trump, they would never have been allowed into our country in the first place. With that, I ask for adoption of this measure and yield back the balance of my time. Gentleman yields. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 53, the previous question is ordered on the bill. The question is on the third reading of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. Third reading. The question is on pass.
An act to require the Secretary of Homeland Security to take into custody aliens who have been charged in the United States with theft and for other purposes.
The question is on passage of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The bill is passed. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I'd like to request the ayes and the nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess subject to the call of the Chair.